We're going to be talking binge eating today, and it's a word that's used. I see NYC, awesome. Uh, I definitely am watching the chat. Austin, Texas, fantastic. At the end of today, and I don't know how long we're going to go. I'm totally open to. I see Philly in the house, Texas. My favorite person in the world, Natalie's here. At the end of today, I'm open to suggestions on upcoming topics. So towards the end, please, as you're kind of wrapping up, as we wrap up, or before you leave, you want to make some suggestions for upcoming topics. I am absolutely open to that. I'm planning to do this every week on Friday at 4 p.m. Pacific time for the unforeseen future. As long as people show up and engage, I'm going to do it. So live is all about engagement. You know, I've posted a lot of little short videos on YouTube, and there's no engagement, right? So there's nothing that really happens. Whereas here, I get to respond to you and answer questions as they come up. So today I'm going to be presenting information, somewhat scientific, but hopefully digestible, pun intended. And if you identify with the stuff I'm saying, let it be known, okay? Binge eating is a term that's used frequently, and I think there's a lot of confusion around what it means. In other words, it is quite subjective. I see Mark. This was actually Mark's suggestion when I posted opening up for topics. What do people want to hear about? Mark said, why do I binge eat? And here we are talking about binge eating a couple days later. And Kyle's in the house. Frederick's here. This is particularly, relevant to those of us that are in recovery. There's a lot of, aberrant eating behavior, whether it be in early recovery or later on down the line. For a lot of people, dysfunctional eating patterns become the final frontier, like the thing that still persists after all of the other problems have been licked, right? So, for example, someone is able to solve the drink problem, the drug problem, the sex problem, the nicotine problem, and there it is, right? The food stuff still persists. So I'm hoping to dispel some myths around binge eating and to hopefully give some clarity. And the whole point of it today, if you identify with this information, is to be more clear on solutions, right? I'm going to be presenting 3 theories today around binge eating, and they're not necessarily completely divergent. In other words, these 3 theories that I'm going to present are very much overlapping. So if you think about a Venn diagram, right? Information converges and diverges. So hopefully I'll be able to make some really good insights around the different reasons why people binge, and maybe you'll discover that you fit in maybe more over here compared to over there, and that will inform the best solution per se. I see Sophia's here, Yossi. I know I missed some people that came in, and I apologize. I'm trying to do the shout out thing because that's what live is. It gives us a chance to engage. So I really just want to say thank you for joining. And feel free to stay as long as you can. I'll, of course, catch a resentment if you leave early, but that's just life, right? Again, thank you so much. We're going to be talking about the difference between binge eating and binge eating disorder. Now, binge eating is, like I said, subjective. So people will use that term really loosely. In other words, you'll hear someone who describes having dinner and then getting like a second plate, trifinia's here, and feeling like they were full, and then using the term binge to describe it. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong. Yay, I see friends. I see friends in the house. Thank you. I'm not saying that it would be wrong to use that term. I'm just saying people use the term really lightly, right? Even like if you think about someone who had a snack late at night, and they had a piece of toast, and they, toast with butter and jelly, let's say at 11 o'clock at night, and then they had a second one before they went to bed. That to one person might feel like a binge. But then someone else, they're like, yeah, that's 2 pieces of toast. That's not a binge, right? Once upon a time, binge eating disorder had some kind of quantitative component to it. In other words, there was some suggestive of an amount of food that would require a binge. And that's no longer true. Binge eating disorder was not a standalone diagnosis in the DSM-4. It was an area for more research. So the classic eating disorders are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. Binge eating disorder didn't become its own clinical diagnosis until 2013 when the DSM-5 was released. So there was enough evidence to suggest that binge eating can become a disorder. And this is in the DSM-5, which is the Statistical Manual for Mental Health. So I want to reiterate that point. What we're talking about today is not just physical health, not just weight-related or food-related. Binge eating disorder is a mental health disorder. And that's really important to know. So yes, we use the term binge eating loosely, but binge eating disorder is an actual diagnosis with an IDC-10 code. So I want to share with you the criteria for binge eating disorder, and then we'll get into some of the debates and some of the divergent, convergent theories, etc. So in the DSM-5, binge eating disorder has to meet certain criteria in order to get the quote-unquote diagnosis. The first one says recurrent episodes of binge eating characterized by, 1, eating amount definitely larger than normal within a 2-hour period. So it no longer says eating this amount, it says larger than normal, right? So maybe the second piece of toast that Alan said he just does on a normal Tuesday would be more than normal for some person, and that might be normal for someone else. So there's a kind of a need for something to kind of diverge from normative behavior. And the second one here is a really important one. It says a sense of lack of control over eating during the episode. So loss of control is a very important component of addictive disorders. It's part of the substance use disorder criteria. And I see so many friends joining. Thank you, Ziva. And lack of control is a part of binge eating. Now, it says further, there's more criteria. The episode has 3 or more of the following. 1, eating much more rapidly than normal. So there's a criteria for a speed of consumption. So more rapidly than normal, or 2, eating until feeling uncomfortably full, which is again very subjective. Some person might feel uncomfortably full from just having a little bit more than they're used to, and the next person, some people are identifying, right? That's me. The next person might require, going through a second drive-through, right? And having an entire second meal after the first one in order to get that uncomfortably full. So people's, gastrointestinal tracts have different, capacities per se. So there's a lot of subjectiveness there. Number 3 is eating large amounts when not physically hungry. So this is going to be related to our first theory that we're going to talk about. Not being hungry, in other words, eating for other reasons other than hunger. For example, emotional hunger, which is something we're going to talk about today. Eating alone because of embarrassment. This one's really important. One of my intake questions is, do you eat differently when you're alone compared to when you're around other people? So a lot of people have body image issues, identity issues, sense of self issues, or just don't integrate well when it comes to food. So there's a lot of secretive eating with binge eating, and that's an important part of the criteria. And lastly, feeling disgusted, depressed, and guilty. And this is where the mental health part of it becomes really, really clear. I see people identifying with the emotional stuff. I'm just bored and eat. So we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Anxiety is a common one. Anxiety and stress, by the way, I see someone say that's really important because some people, when they're anxious and they're stressed, they stress eat, and other people lose their appetite. If there's anyone that feels stressed and anxious and then completely loses their appetite, you can say hello, because I know that there's people that have that. The thing about that is that whenever you lose your appetite, there's a really good chance that when it returns, it's going to be way more ravenous than it was before. So yeah, stress and anxiety as emotions can go kind of both different directions for people. And then marked distress. This is common with psychiatric disorders. Emotional impairment, social and emotional distress. These are things that characterize quote unquote disorders. And then there's a timestamp on it. It has to occur once a week for at least 3 months. I'm seeing people identifying, hands are going up, thumbs are going up. So it's not just something that happens every once in a while. So let me give you some examples of things that happen once in a while. For example, if someone's been on drugs for a long time and they go to a detox and they've been on, let's say, heroin and meth, and all of a sudden in detox, there's going to probably be overeating, and it might even seem like binge eating. People might even wake up during the middle of the night to eat. I can say that's happened to me, and that might feel like binge eating, but in order for that to be a disorder, it would have to happen regularly and persist after the detox period. Another example would be a marathon. Everyone that's familiar with marathons know people carb load beforehand, and sometimes after the race, there's a huge amount of food that's consumed. Someone might call that a binge, but it wouldn't be binge eating disorder unless it occurred regularly, right? And I've done a few marathons, and I can certainly remember some of the meals that I've had afterwards. Someone made a joke about eating in recovery. They put down the spoon and pick up the fork, right? That's a real common little saying that we have. Another reason why people might binge eat is because of food insecurity. Sometimes if there isn't a lot of food around, when you finally do get the access to food, it'll seem more important to eat it, right? Food insecurity is something that I've gotten really interested in. It really looks at, socially disadvantaged groups. People that are food insecure do have more dysfunctional eating, and even paradoxically, higher BMIs on average. Now, it's really interesting stuff. I want to put binge eating in an evolutionary context before I break down 3 well-established theories. I think in our evolutionary perspective, right? If you think about our ancestors 1,000 years ago, they might go like a day or 2 days without eating. Imagine foraging and looking for animals, and there's no food around, right? If you went 2 days without eating and then you found a mango tree, right? It might be normal for, let's just say, our ancestors 1,000 years ago to eat 8 mangoes, right? You want to really power up, get your glycogen replenished so you can keep going. And that might be a normative behavior 1,000 years ago when food was more scarce. Now we live in an era of food abundance, right? And we're going to talk about that. I see someone talked about refined sugar. That's going to, kind of go in line with one of the theories that I'm going to present shortly. And yes, I really appreciate you guys for being here and for being attention. And the comments do make it really, really awesome. And I'm going to open it up for questions after I get through a couple more points. So the main point I want to make in the beginning is, when does binge eating become pathological? In other words, it's probably not just when someone feels guilty about overeating because they're not as fit as they want to be. Now, that could be a pathological thing, but it's going to depend on, as we looked at in the criteria, the amount of distress that it causes someone, the amount of loss of control. And I'm seeing people identifying with the food insecurity piece, right? A lot of people that were food insecure as a child. It's a great point. If you're not sure when your next meal is going to come, or if you've been incarcerated, right? You're not sure when the food's coming, or you are sure when the food's coming, but it's not going to be enough. You develop binge eating patterns, and then those patterns persist. So I think some of these patterns have some genetic or evolutionary components. If you think about our ancestors who had the 10 mangoes at the mango tree, or perhaps some of our experiences in our lives maybe have lent itself to times when binge eating made a lot of sense. The question is, when does it persist and when does it become pathological? So I'm going to give you 3 theories to consider. Again, I'm going to throw up the Venn diagram to just be really clear that I'm not saying they're different theories, but they have areas of convergence and divergence. Now, one of them's basic, one of them's really well established, and one of them's controversial, okay? The first theory, as you all probably would predict, is about emotional eating, right? I heard already people connecting with boredom, depression, anxiety, and this has been really well established in the therapeutic community. Psychologists, therapists, etc., have often noticed in people that have food challenges that it will be linked to emotion. So, for example, one of the sayings that we have in this space is, it's not what you're eating, it's what's eating you, right? So it's less about the food. This is one of these theories that say it's not really about the food. It's about underlying emotional stuff, whether that be attachment stuff, trauma stuff, mood disorders, etc. If some of that's unresolved, it's going to play out in food. Now, this theory's been around a while. That's why I call it basic. It doesn't do a great job in explaining all of the binge eating, but it does make sense to most people, right? Are there any other emotions that people might eat over that I missed? We've talked about stress, anxiety, depression, boredom, feeling rejected, right? That's a huge one. Feeling alone or not enough, right? Those are common ones. If anyone has any other reasons why, they might connect their emotions to the binge, I'd love to hear them. Because everyone's different, right? So emotional eating's been around for a while, and it lends itself joy. I love that, right? When there's not a cloud on the horizon, right? When things are going great, let's overdo it. Such an important point. Thank you for that, Sydney. And then, there's got to be more. Depression, grief. Thank you for that. There's a lot of different reasons why people will have loss of control eating, especially now with the coronavirus. People are having challenges, increasingly. I haven't seen the data yet because it hasn't been published, but I wish I was the one to do it, to kind of track the increase in dysfunctional eating with the social distancing and the being at home. I see grief, self-sabotage, rejection, reward, which we're going to talk about. Thank you, Sean, for pointing that out. So again, emotional eating's been around, I think, the longest as a theory. And we're going to get into the second theory, which I see someone already setting me up for the slam dunk, the side effect of chronic dieting. The more established theory for binge eating is restraint and restriction. So this is really well accepted, and it's probably what I use the most as a theoretical framework for looking at binge eating. Basically, what we've found out is that whenever people create certain rules about what to eat and what not to eat, decide, for example, I'm going to cut carbs, I'm going to go on keto, you can predict what that person's going to be binging on, right? No shocker there, right? As soon as some sugar or carbs hits the tongue, they're way more sensitive to it because they've been so deprived, per se. So it's almost like the pendulum swings all the way to one end, and it's been an extreme diet, and that lends itself to going all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where we see rebound appetite. Now, this could happen on a day basis, like if someone does no carbs all day and then they binge on carbs at midnight. But what's also true is that dietary restraint and dietary restriction can affect people over their lifespan. So for example, even if someone did successful eating for 2 years, let's say they were preparing for a bodybuilding show and they did carb cycling and they were able to be really successful in their dietary restraint and restriction, after that period ends, say like 6 months later, they could have binge eating behavior almost as a neuroadaptation to the period of restriction or restraint. And this is, like I said, pretty well established in the eating disorder treatment community. When we see binging, we always kind of look at where is the dieting, right? Some people take this theory to the max and say that all binging comes from restricting in the first place. Now, that's a perfect example of how someone has a really single theory mind. They see everything through one lens. Now, I'll say that this theory is very consistent with the work that I do. And again, I'm going to show the Venn diagram just to suggest that there's multiple theories, and emotional eating and restriction can certainly overlap. I've heard some people talk about restricting emotions, right? So for example, if they have a lot of unresolved stuff that's coming up and they don't express it and they're restricting their emotions, they're not saying what's going on with them, that eventually that can lead to the explosion, right? So that's a psychological or therapeutic framework to look at binge eating from this kind of different lens. So instead of restricting carbs and then binging on carbs, they might be restricting their emotions and then have a big emotional eating episode, per se. And I'm wondering if anyone identifies with that. Um, you know, one other common thing, you know, I said carbs is a common thing people cut out, but dairy is another one, right? People that cut out dairy, guess what they usually end up binging on? Ice cream and pizza, right? So I found that restriction isn't just necessarily either an emotion or a specific food group. Some people are identifying with the dairy thing because a lot of people cut that out. But it also has to do with textures and temperatures, right? So if you cut out certain categories of food, it's not so much that you needed the nutrients in them. Maybe you needed the texture or the temperature. For example, something that's cold and creamy, your brain's already learned it, right? So if you've had a lot of ice cream in your life, for example, and then all of a sudden you decide one day I'm not going to have any more dairy, your brain's already learned the creamy mouthfeel. Your trigeminal nerve detects the saturated fat, and it's going to already start signaling and registering that, like, something's missing, right? Something that I used to have, that I used to know is missing. So dietary restriction and restraint could be a food group. It could be a macronutrient. It could be an emotion, but it could also be a tactile part of food, sometimes crunch, right? So when I help people in recovery from an eating disorder create a food plan or some kind of guiding principles, one of the major guiding principles that I like to encourage is to make sure you get all of the different textures, temperatures, and different sensations. So cold, hot, creamy, crunchy, salty, sweet, right? You need sweet somewhere. The universe intended us to get some sweet from fruit. One of the things we see really common is the low carb approach. People cut out fruit completely and they start eating artificial sweeteners. And I just want to come out and say it. I'm just going to be bold. Any diet that cuts out fruit and uses a bunch of artificial sweeteners is going to cause you problems over your lifespan, okay? Because our brain is designed to get some kind of sweet. You're basically saying, I'm going to trick the universe, right? I'm going to trick the brain, and you might be able to do it for a little while. In other words, you might be able to get that summer body, but guess what? Come wintertime, as soon as a little bit of sweet hits your mouth, it's going to lend itself to loss of control. I see spicy. Thank you. I miss spicy. That's so important too. You got to get all the textures and temperatures so that you're not missing anything. Now, there's ways to do this. You know, for example, if you really want to cut out dairy, which a lot of people do, use a coconut yogurt, right? Use something that has a mimicky effect, that has a creamy effect. That's why a lot of people that go plant-based, they use these alternative meats because it mimics the thing that they were missing. Once the brain learns something, right, it expects it, right? And I'm seeing some amens, right? People say they don't eat bananas, right, because it's too much sugar. That might be great for you to deal with short-term body dissatisfaction, but what we're saying is that over your life course, it's going to be a major predictor of binge eating behavior. I'm so glad people are agreeing. Thank you for the comments. It really helps me. Now, I'm going to talk about the last theory, which is the controversial one, and it's one that I've done a lot of research on. It's the theory of food addiction, right? Food addiction is actually like looking at the specifics of the food a little bit differently than the dietary restraint or the restriction. I see Susan Zinn is in the house. I'm so happy to see some awesome Instagrammers here joining us. Thank you, thank you. So we've got our three theories, right? And I'm going to put up the Venn diagram. We've got emotional eating, we've got dietary restraint and restriction, and we've got food addiction. Now, food addiction, like I said, makes a lot of people uncomfortable because there seems to be some debate around what it actually means. So for example, people know what addiction means, but there's some debate about what one would consider food, right? So when we talk about food addiction, we're really not talking about like being addicted to an almond or a banana. It's really talking about highly palatable foods that have been refined in certain ways that make them register by the brain very, very differently. So the emotional eating theory kind of suggests that it's not about the food, right? It's not what you're eating, it's what's eating you. And then the dietary restraint and restriction theory is really saying that it's really not so much about the food, it's about what you're trying to do to avoid certain foods that makes you end up binging on them. Now, the food addiction theory is kind of saying, you know what? It's actually about the food. And this theory resonates with a lot of people that don't have a history of restriction. So for example, a lot of people are saying, I do this criteria in the DSM-5. I eat sometimes more than normal, lack of control, sometimes it's rapidly, I'm not hungry, it's distressful, it happens often, and there is no sign of dietary restraint or restriction. Now this is a perfect chance to really understand how heterogeneous disordered eating is and how one theory never is going to capture the entire population. Now I can say clinically, I deal with mostly people that have dietary restraint and restriction, and the reason is because the solution there is much clearer. The solution is let's learn how to reintegrate and stop being so restrictive. For example, with some of the tactics I showed you today about inclusion, starting to eat small amounts of the different things again so your brain gets all of the sensations, right, that it expects. Food addiction is much more tricky because, what does it mean if someone is food addicted? And the reason that that's so controversial is because when people try to cut out, for example, a bunch of addictive foods, then guess what? That becomes often leading into the dietary restraint and the restriction, which then leads back to the binge. So people that often try to use a food addiction approach fail. And they fail because it's not socially acceptable to be really rigid about food. Now, I think that's going to change. I think that in the next 10 years, as more science suggests that a lot of people are binging because of altered neurochemistry, so I'm talking about the dopamine system and the opioid system, responding to sugar, salt, fat, flavors, refined grains, and that being a major cause of binge eating and other forms of food-related dysfunction, I think people are going to kind of wake up a little bit and, really see that some people need to be a little bit more diligent about their food. I see some people have had the food addiction definition all wrong. Yeah, I think food addiction is very misunderstood. I think the major consequence of food addiction is that it trains the brain to expect food to taste a certain way. In other words, people that have food addiction, they don't really love eating other foods that aren't really highly palatable per se. Now, what's also important to know about food addiction is that people that have dietary restraint and restriction have higher levels of addiction-like eating behavior. So this is the other criticism of that third theory, is that when people engage in dieting, it ends up creating the symptoms of food addiction. Therefore, a lot of the research on food addiction is not clear because it doesn't adjust for dietary restriction or for restraint. And the reason I presented three theories is because there are people that don't have restraint or restriction, but have food addiction, and then they have binge eating disorder. And it's tricky because there isn't a lot of good treatment out there, right? The commonly accepted model that I use and that most eating disorder treatment centers use is the restraint restriction model, and we work on inclusion and getting people to stop dieting per se. Now that can also be effective for food addiction. People think that food addiction requires a really restrictive approach where you just have to get on some set diet and lose weight, and those are the misconceptions that make the construct way more confusing. Food addiction isn't about increased stigma, it's about decreased stigma. It looks beyond the individual and it starts to look at the food industry, the manufacturing practices, the corporate greed that has really changed the food supply in order to maximize their profits at the expense of public health. So I think there's a lot of confusion around this third theory. A lot of people have the food addiction and the dietary restraint going together. And like I said at the original opening of today, you can have all three, right? Most people have emotional eating, dietary restraint and restriction, and food addiction. Now, what are some of the solutions, right? So when we think about areas of, convergence and divergence, it really points to individual assessment. So one of the things that I help people do when they see me in my office or if we do Zoom sessions is to figure out what's the most true for you. Which of these three theories kind of resonates the most? Are you in, do you have all three? Are you somewhere here? What is the theory of binge eating that resonates as the most true for you? And by the way, these things can change over time, right? So having a theory resonate with you might be true today, but over time, something might evolve. And then once you know your kind of overlap, right, where you kind of sit on the Venn diagram, it's easier to know what direction to head. So for example, if it really is just emotional eating, maybe someone needs like a really good therapist, right, to do some work to learn how to be more tolerant to distress, right? Learn other coping tools. Maybe that's something that I can help someone with as well. And emotional eating has it points to solutions that aren't necessarily fully food related, right? The second theory, which is the dietary restraint and restriction, really does suggest that if someone's binge eating and it's caused by restraint and restriction, the solution really is inclusion, right? We need to learn how to add these things back in strategically, maybe add things that are similar, maybe add better versions of them, and add things so that your brain isn't deprived, right? And I'm loving the feedback. Thank you all so much. And that treatment model is challenging for people because, especially if they think that they need to lose weight, right? Including things that I've been avoiding is going to be so baffling for people, especially when there's body dissatisfaction. And that's when, body positivity and health at every size and some of those other powerful messages that we're carrying can make a difference. But the third model has the least clear solution. Some people do benefit from cutting out refined sugars and refined flours and cutting out things that have been problematic. Now, it doesn't always lead to return binging. Some people do really, really well on exclusive kind of diet plans. But I believe that in order to do that, there needs to be social support. There needs to be recovery. You can't just do that in the society we live in today. It's sort of doomed to fail per se. So when you use binge eating theoretical models to figure out a solution, it's really important to put it in the context of your life, right? In other words, if you live in a household where there's all these different types of food exposures, this solution might not work so well. So individual assessment leads to a really clear picture of what the best way to treat binge eating is. And then you have to put it in the context of your kind of home environment, family environment, community environment. And then it's, more clear what direction you want to head. A lot of people with a history of substance use disorder, have, addiction-like eating. And there's a lot of debate on, how restrictive should a person be or how inclusive should a person be. And that really is dependent on, the individual, the time. For example, and I see Nash, thank you. I see people referring to the steps. There's definitely programs where people can work the steps around food. I've been very helpful to people in those communities, especially as a person in recovery myself. So yes, binge eating disorder is heterogeneous. It's not just this single thing that exists where there's one treatment model. And that's one of my major criticisms of the current eating disorder treatment world. They have a single model, it seems. They say that there's, individualized treatment, but when it comes to nutrition, there's really not. There needs to be a wider range of possibilities for people. For some people, it's not about the food. And they need to get really good therapy, get inclusive. And for other people, it's about the food. The food matters, and it needs to be a really clear nutritional strategy. So you want to get clear on what you suffer from, right? That's the first step, so you can get clear on what the solution is, right? And that's the second step, to get clear on what direction you're headed and be open to the possibility that that could change over time. In the current pandemic, we'll call it, a lot of people are binge eating. It might just be emotional. It might be because you're trying to lose weight and you feel frustrated and you end up cutting things out, or you had a body image attack. For other people, the chronic exposure to the highly palatable foods is changing our brains and making it more difficult. But I'll say this, for most people, it's a combination of all three. And that's where treatment gets tricky, trying to figure out the right message of why people binge. And I'm seeing the yes, right? So it isn't always clear. It's not like, oh, this is this problem, this is this solution, this is this. It's about where they overlap, where it gets really tricky. So most people that binge eat have a combination of all three theories: the emotional eating theory, the dietary restraint restriction theory, and the somewhat controversial food addiction theory. But there's a way out. There's a road to recovery, and there's people like me that love helping people that have binge eating. I see Sarah in the house. Thank you, thank you. And Zoom works great. There's apps. There's so many different ways to recover from binge eating these days. And sometimes it's a long road, right? Like years of treatment. Sometimes you just need a couple of sessions where you just get a little wake-up call and get a little bit of chunky truth, and you're able to move toward recovery. And if there's any main message I want to say before I open it up for any questions, is that the key part about binge eating disorder, whatever theory it is, wherever you kind of overlap, whatever combination you have, is that it's about recovery. And recovery is an inside job that requires some work around here. And I just love seeing, people rise up and get well. And, there's awesome providers out there. I see Sydney is pointing out it's important to work with someone that's awesome. She's in New York. She does really good work. I'm here in LA. There's so many people that are reaching out right now for help, and that's why I started doing these lives, so I can provide information so you can either work on it your own or work with each other, or feel free to reach out to me. You can always send me a direct message. I want to hear from some people that have comments that have, yes, I see people saying nutrition apps that count calories. It's super exhausting. I use apps that don't count calories, and they're more focused on mental health rather than physical health. So if you're trying to recover from binge eating disorder, using an app that's very quantitative is very risky, in my opinion, because it lends itself to the wrong message. Calories send the wrong message when it comes to recovery. If people are thinking in terms of calories, they're going to make choices based on calories, and calories do not equal nutrition. For example, someone might choose the 100-calorie snack pack over the 150-calorie raspberries, right? And I saw Natalie say our favorite line, don't count your calories, count your blessings, right? And that's where recovery happens. So I guess I'm here on live. I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to answer all the questions, right? Part of me wants to hold back a little bit, so you reach out. But yeah, I see Trifenia said the Rise app, which is a great one. I use the app Recovery Record, which is really well established. And I have people, you could just do photos, and it's more about emotions and hunger and fullness and all of that different kind of stuff. So apps are helpful for some people, but they're harmful for others. In other words, some people have a long history of using apps and reviewing your day. Sometimes the solution for binge eating disorder is to get off of the apps and not start using the app, right? And so it really depends on the individual what the best treatment plan is. I see someone saying, what is my favorite snack? I have always been a big fan of large snacks and like kind of smaller meals, bridging the gap between meals and snacks, right? So for me, I'll have a snack that has multiple food groups, right? Rather than just like a single piece of fruit or nuts. I put the fruit and the nuts and a little bit of yogurt. I put it all together, right? And have a kind of small meal. That's how I roll with the snacks. I see some questions about caffeine and binge eating. I think caffeine's very dopaminergic. I'm actually going to do a live on caffeine in a few weeks. People that have a tendency for substance-seeking behavior are more likely to seek other substances. So someone that's been on a caffeine roller coaster, their dopamine system is kind of responsive to that, are more likely to have food-related roller coasters. So it's just cross addiction, in my opinion. I really think that caffeine doesn't get enough attention. I've struggled with caffeine a lot. I'm a person in recovery. I've been sober 13 years, and I've had some difficulties with caffeine, and I'm finally off of it. I'm finally off of caffeine for a few months now, and I just feel so much better. Now, I say that, everyone's like, Dave, don't say that. Don't take away my coffee. I'm not trying to tell you need to do that. I'm trying to say that after 10 years of abusing caffeine, it changed my brain chemistry to where it was no longer working for me. And I was able to get off the caffeine wagon, and I feel really good about that. And food is similar for some people. Some people really have tried the inclusion thing and the intuitive eating thing for so long, but it just lends itself to eventually, like, you got to have some clear guidelines or boundaries. And I support that. I see something about food addiction. How do you suggest people handle trigger foods? That's kind of an approach that's common in the 12-step world. People feel like there's foods that are very triggering, and what do you do? In other words, do you make a list of them and then never eat them and make your abstinence based on those trigger foods? I'm just going to go ahead and say it. In some cases, that is the best thing to do. For other people, it's more of the cognitive restraint and the cognitive distortions and the black and white thinking that kind of lends itself to those being trigger foods. So it's a perfect example of how needing to discern between the food addiction theory and the restraint theory is really, really important. A lot of people think they're food addicted, but they're really just dieters. You know what I'm saying? So sometimes people come to me for food addiction recovery and like they get a little bit different than they were hoping. And some people come to me for intuitive eating, and I tell them straight up, like, you resemble more of an addiction-like eater, right? And like those things are really important. It's someone, you got to be bold to be able to feel like confident in your assessment. So yes, trigger foods is a loaded word, and people do approach it differently. But yes, some people do best getting rid of those foods, and in other cases, it's just a contributing part of the problem. I see Whitney said, she quoted me on something she heard me say once, is that in recovery, we want to choose foods that we love, but also foods that love us back, right? Certain foods that you might love don't have love for you back. They're just some kind of corporate ploy to maximize profit. We want to find the intersection foods that we love and that love us back. Natalie says, when I feel better inside, I look so much better on the outside. I didn't talk much about body image today in the binge eating topic area because it's going to be alive in upcoming weeks. I think it's such an important topic. When I help people make peace with food, you really have to make peace with body. If you don't make peace with body, you can't make peace with food. So the body image piece is critical. In other words, if you're highly dissatisfied and you've internalized weight bias, it's going to be really hard to be inclusive and to be peaceful around food. I saw someone say that, the opposite problem, not eating at all. That's definitely something that I'll probably address at some point, the more restrictive eating disorders. Sugar, we'll talk about. Tiffany put her thumbs up. What about decaf? I don't know. So sometimes getting that flavor can help you transition off of it, right? But I wouldn't suggest that as a long-term kind of strategy per se. People are asking about caffeine. Someone asked, am I a clinical dietitian? Yeah, I should have introduced myself better. I'm a master's level registered dietitian, and I'm finishing my 3rd year at UCLA as a PhD student. I'm in the School of Public Health, and I'm minoring in health psychology. So I spend half my time doing clinical work. Clinical is a tricky word. I'm an outpatient, so I don't work in clinical settings. I work in an outpatient setting in a private practice, right? And I spend my other half of the time doing research, which is why I follow so many journal articles. What's the best way to approach a family member who has a food addiction? So tricky, right? Sometimes you try to intervene and it just makes things worse, right? Sometimes the best example is to just be the example, right? The best thing to do is just be the example. Sometimes people come around, when you try to put pressure on people, it lends itself to some of that negative stuff that lends itself to dieting and then the rebound binging, etc. So yes, intervening is tricky, and it requires someone that's skilled. I saw a joke, I just want to diet, right? And I heard someone say a long time ago, it's one of the oldest jokes in the book, don't diet, live it. It's not a diet, it's a lifestyle change. Anything that feels diety is likely to cause problems for some people. Diet culture's kind of, under a lot of scrutiny now for being causal. I think stigma is also a hot topic, and I'm making notes of things to talk about. I'm going to talk about weight stigma. Any other suggestions of things to talk about in upcoming weeks? I'm writing them down if anyone wants to put them in. Sean asked about the term cheat day. I hate that term, cheat day. I mean, if that term could go away, I would be so happy. It's a fitness term, And it's really used to target people that are, dieters and that are like, maybe they identify as successful dieters, right? They're able to do this thing and then have a day where they deviate. And the reason I don't like it is because, like, what are you cheating on, right? They say you're cheating on something. It has a negative connotation. I'm a big fan of doing all non-punitive approaches to nutrition. Someone asked if this is being recorded. I don't know how this works. It's my first live. I'm going to do it every week on Fridays at